Well, Zoe Daniel, thank you so much for saying yes to have a chat to me. When I was thinking about the fact that we are days away from, I feel like we say this routinely, but arguably one of the biggest elections of our lifetime in terms of the significance it's going to play on the generation to come. I thought no one better to touch base with and get a sense of the pulse of America and what is transpiring over there than you. You've spent the better part of the last 4 or 5 years, I think, as the ABC's bureau chief over in Washington, DC. I wanted to ask, because I know you've toured, I think, upward of 40 of the 50 states of the US. What did you learn from that pulse check as you travelled around America over the last few years?
That it's a country extremely divided, and so much so that partisanship means that people who have opposing views frequently either cannot or don't speak to each other. There is a political divide, but there's also a geographic divide to some degree, where you have people in large coastal cities who have a lot of economic, cultural, social benefits that surround the places where they live and have benefited from multilateral trade policy, for example, globalization, all the great things that we get from living in this big wide world. But then the antithesis of that is for people, not all people, but many people who live in the inland states, who come from generations of manufacturing workers, for example, mining workers, blue-collar industries of all sorts, who have seen their lifestyles deteriorate. And to some degree, I think it's quite an emotional issue for those people, as well as an economic issue, in that sense of American exceptionalism of being the best, but not only being the best now, having the brightest future and being able to deliver that to your children has been lost for a lot of those people, that they can't see optimism. And I think that was a lot of what drove the election of Donald Trump in 2016, a sense of, yeah, he's an imperfect human, but he's not a politician, he's the anti-politician, and people kind of wanting someone who was prepared to be very direct, shed political correctness, and sort of speak for them and provide them with a voice. Has he done that? Well, this is the question that we're kind of facing next week with the election.
It's interesting to hear you talk about kind of the lack of optimism and hope when that was so much of the narrative, certainly, that surrounded the Obama administration. Did what you picked up on surprise you, or did you really find it was what you were anticipating when you started touring around the country?
Well, I knew it would be there, but I was surprised at how deeply that ran. And unfortunately, I think that the Obama years in some ways deepened that sense of disappointment. That, there are a lot of Republicans in some of those states that flipped to Obama and then felt that he didn't really deliver what he promised to them. So there's that. And then there's also that sense of, to a degree, fear of too much change that Obama created in others. So there was sort of a twofold sense of everything's changing too rapidly for me. I don't like that. And also it hasn't actually delivered me anything anyway, even though this was supposed to be, the era of hope. So, I think it's arguable that part of Trump's election was a backlash against Obama, in part of a cohort who perhaps did either vote for Obama and then flipped to Trump, or just decided not to bother voting in 2016.
I had a colleague the other day who described sort of the choice at this election as seemingly sort of a choice between the economy, because that seems to be a very huge part of what Trump's running on, and almost the heart, like this notion of taking a principled approach to racism, to climate change, to all these sorts of issues that the Biden ticket's running on. Is that how you'd characterise the fork in the road moment that America faces next Tuesday?
Well, that's definitely one way of looking at it, and that's the way that I would have looked at it in kind of like January. I think coronavirus has just changed everything to the extent that it's a question of, well, is this election actually about anything other than COVID now? The handling of it, okay, it's not Trump's fault that COVID came, but how that's been managed, the death toll, the language that he's used around it, the parading around outside the hospital, we've got the greatest medicine in the world when he had, more than a dozen doctors treating him, when many Americans don't even have basic health care, a sense of being a bit tone deaf around those sorts of things. So, if I could just sort of put COVID on the shelf there first and say, that's a big light that's shining over the top of everything that happens next week. But I do think that it's interlinked quite intricately with the economy, clearly. And polls would show that the majority of people think that Biden would be better at managing COVID, but the majority think that Trump would be better at managing the economy. And to some extent, that's a reflection of the fact that, Trump's timing was pretty good. He came in after Obama had done some very good repairing of the economy post-GFC. Trump has been able to maximise that with tax cuts, removing regulations and all sorts of things that, a lot of people don't like, but those who want that economic growth support that. So that picture looked quite good in terms of jobs and stuff like that at the start of this year. And I do think that, one thing that I learned in 2016 in all those travels, especially in the inland states, is most people vote on what's in their hip pocket. It's to do with how much money am I earning, how secure is my job, can I put my kids through college, do I have enough money to have a comfortable life to feed the optimism that we talked about. So now we're at this sort of weird crossroads where people have to make a decision about whether Trump can still kind of deliver that to them, even with that overlay of COVID. And then, just quickly, without being too long-winded, but I think there's a really interesting sort of social factor with what you've talked about in regard to people being judged on the basis of how they vote. Like, if you vote for Trump, you're a bad person because you obviously don't care about people who've died of COVID. You don't care about environmental policy. You don't care about, the treatment of women. You don't care about sort of America's position in the world. Therefore, there's like a kind of really big ethical judgment being made of people. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic because there's a possibility that actually pushes more people towards Trump.
So interesting you say that, isn't it, when you think about one of the parts of the 2016 phenomena being the classification of Trump voters as deplorables, and one of the polling challenges being a lot of people not wanting to identify as being a Trump voter, sort of skewing what was people's expectation of how the vote would split. I wanted to ask you that because I don't want to mischaracterize your opinion, but a few months ago I felt like probably both of us were sitting in the camp of going, it looks like he might take the White House again. Do you now
100%.
feel it's done and dusted?
Yeah. No. Look, 6 months ago, I mean, what are we? This year's been such a blur. It's now the end of October. February, like pre-COVID, I would have said he was walking back into a second term. Absolutely, no question. And, I'm probably more bullish on that than a lot of my friends, journo friends. But, my read on it was that the Democrats hadn't really sort of revived themselves post that shock of 2016, that Biden wasn't going to be a kind of sexy enough candidate. It's a bit too bland, doesn't really motivate people necessarily. And, Trump, he kind of, like with all the things he's done wrong, it's never been enough to stick. And he's still managed to control the narrative, to control the conversation. COVID hit and he suddenly lost control of the conversation. There was a thing that was bigger than him all of a sudden. And it's been the only thing in the last 5 years that's kind of knocked him off the front page or off cable TV. And sort of it's been the only thing that's really stuck to him in terms of people really sort of drilling down into negatives about his performance. So from that perspective, I think there's a very real possibility that Biden will win. Obviously, all the polls are pointing that way. That said, even a week out, I'm definitely not prepared to say that Biden will win the election. I don't think anyone knows who's going to win. Like, I think if anyone told you that they were sure who was going to win next week, that would be a rare bird. I think it's possibly 20% chance that Trump could take it. But, as we saw in 2016, it's about taking it in the right states. And you know, I learned a big lesson, Holly, when I was travelling around Western Pennsylvania a few days before the 2016 election. Hillary was up in all the national polls, and in Pennsylvania she was up by, I think it was about 5.6 points. Wow. And we were driving around and all we were seeing was Trump-Pence yard signs. And I just thought, something's wrong here. These polls are skewed, or else, I don't know, I'm spending too much time in the wrong places. But that really sealed my suspicion that he was going to win the election. And, I'm hearing from my journo friends who are still, even with COVID, able to do that to some degree, who have travel stories reflecting something similar, that there is still a highly motivated group out there that will be voting for Donald Trump next week.
Oh, without question. I think, and I agree with you. It's sort of that uncertainty, partly because I think polling's been shown to be anyone's best guess, and also this year because we've got people voting at so many different points in the electoral cycle. It's very interesting to kind of get a read on who's winning at any given point. But I also think it's an interesting test of a phenomenon. Like, you normally want a positive motivator. Like when we talk about goal setting, you want to be for something. It's better than a anti. And so I'm intrigued for how that will net out, because to your point, Biden's not a particularly sexy candidate. So you're relying on a anti-Trump force being greater than the degree to which he can motivate his base. And I'm very intrigued to see how that turns out, particularly in some of the battleground states.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? And I think the other thing that's worth considering is that, a lot of people voted for Trump because they hated Hillary Clinton. And, the basis of that hatred runs very deep and is kind of something that's difficult to understand, I think, for us as, Australians who sit back and go, well, she's this incredibly well-qualified woman. But, people were so deeply suspicious of her that it pushed a lot of people towards Trump. In that sense, Biden's kind of, the small target strategy means that he can just sit there and go, I'm good. I'm like a middle ground guy. I'm not offensive. So, I'm a safe bet kind of thing. But he's not like a highly motivational candidate where people are going to go, oh, I love him. He's awesome. He's so inspiring and charismatic, like an Obama. So is that enough? Is Biden playing the small target enough to actually, firstly, get Democrats out to vote, because turnout is so key, and we've seen a lot of massive pre-voting. But I still just have that seed of doubt. I saw something written that said, there were long queues for pre-voting in Ohio. Everyone was social distancing and wearing masks, so they must have all been Democrats, which I thought was, maybe it's true and that's really interesting. But I'm not ready to assume that all of those who are pre-voting are Democrats, because, again, I just think there's a lot of motivated Trump supporters.
Absolutely. I wanted to pick up on that piece you said around sort of things that are difficult to understand as Australians. One of the things I found since moving back to the Oz this year is just how different our coverage of the US and the US elections and the presidency is to what's happening in America. What do you think we don't understand enough? I know you touched on Hillary there, but about perhaps the current dynamic of the Trump presidency or the election race as it stands. What don't you think we appreciate enough over here?
Look, I think firstly, it's that sense of division. And I think that exists in Australia to a degree, and unfortunately increasingly. But the US being such a bigger population, it sort of magnifies those divides. The degree of passion with which people approach presidential elections and the engagement is very high, which I think is very different to here. It's such a personality-based horse race, a totally different system. And again, that whole sense of what the future holds, the loss of optimism that people have, the division in the social structure, the ability to have healthcare that you can afford, to look after your kids, to afford housing, to provide a decent education. A lot of those things have really splintered over time. And I think there is a sense of people looking for something, sort of looking for a fix. And also, what we see here in terms of coverage tends to be those sort of off-the-wall Trump comments, like that one 20-second grab or that one tweet, and you just kind of go, oh, what on earth? But having sat through so many Trump events and press conferences and interviews and like sort of listened to the whole of what he has to say, I think much as, you know, it shouldn't necessarily be our job to kind of interpret the president, but I think you can actually consider an arc of what he's getting at if you sit and listen to him for an hour. And, you know, therefore the impression can be quite different to just those sort of wild statements that tend to circle around the international media environment without any depth.
Yeah, I actually wondered when Twitter first expanded from 140 characters to 280, whether it was an encouragement to try and get the president to talk in full sentences, because that was so much of the communication vehicle for the administration. And I wanted to ask you, I know you've got a book coming out next year, which I'm super excited to read, that will get into this whole world of American politics and Trump presidency in depth. Do you feel he has fundamentally changed leadership as we know it? Or do you feel this will be the anomaly where we'll look back and go, what happened? Because in terms of the sort of statesman-like way of operating, soft power diplomacy, the way that he engages with the media, so much is a departure from what we have always known. Do you think this will change the game of leadership moving forward?
Yeah, well, so this book has been a completely head-splitting exercise, as you can imagine, trying to just channel, you know, the impact of Donald Trump into, you know, less than 100,000 words, because it's like about 100 books in that.
Okay.
But the subtitle of the book actually is, you know, how Donald Trump has changed the world. And I think he's already changed the world in a lot of ways. I mean, there's several international leaders who have already adopted Trumpism as their sort of campaign strategy. You look at Bolsonaro in Brazil, even the Mexican president, who's a leftist, but a populist leftist, has adopted some of Trump's tactics. You look at Duterte in the Philippines, who perhaps predated Trump in sort of testing some of these tactics, but has been validated by them. You look at the way Trump has interacted with, you know, other leaders on the world stage. So changing that dynamic with Kim Jong-un in North Korea for better or worse, changing that dynamic with the Chinese, the quite combative relationship that he's had with Europe, the questions that he's asked around the funding of NATO, which have actually resulted in a lot of countries putting more money into NATO and the US pulling its funding back, because Trump called out the fact that, well, why should we be paying to defend you guys? This is a kind of exploded foreign policy in many ways. And although I think defence analysts and insiders in Australia, for example, on that front would say, well, that relationship, that defence relationship, military relationship has sort of continued as it was because they tend to operate general to general. But I think that there's a bigger picture sort of world view or approach that has changed, where it's enabled leaders to be a lot more direct. It's enabled a lot of that more diplomatic or politically correct language to be dropped. You know, fake news. I mean, this is a phrase that sort of was around to describe actual fake news, like, you know, using false information online to kind of manipulate people, or just, you know, actual stuff that was wrong. This has now been sort of mobilised by leaders the world over, including here in Australia, as a sort of convenient fallback when the media is reporting something that doesn't play well for them politically. And that has actually eroded our entire perception of what truth is. So, you know, as a reporter now, it's kind of like every word.
How does this world change the game for you? I mean, you've spent your life as a journalist in the media. It feels like you've been under assault for 4 or 5 years. What's your reflection on where the world's at on that front?
Well, it's in some ways it's look, I wouldn't say it's good for the media, but in some ways it does make you apply more rigor to yourself. Like everything I say or write, particularly in my book, I'm very conscious that I need to be able to back that up. You know, so this book, for example, is rigorously footnoted, where previously I would have sourced some aspects of it, but certainly not as rigorously as I've done in this case, because, you know, everything is questioned. So you kind of need to give people like a scope to go, well, is that actually right? Oh, okay, there's the footnote. Okay, I can go and find that and read that, you know, data from the World Health Organization or whoever it might be. But then that drills into another question, doesn't it? Because people will go, oh, WHO's lying. You know, that's not true either. So,
yeah,
you know,
trust?
It's just like, what is the benchmark of truth? You know, truth has become such a nebulous thing. And, you know, from the perspective of the narrative of this book, I mean, again, it's not a good thing, but it sort of perfectly fits the narrative when, you know, towards the end of the book, Trump gets diagnosed with COVID and then half the people in the world don't believe he's actually got it. So, you know, the sort of eroder of truth in chief is no longer believed, you know, in any way, shape or form either. And, you know, that I think that's a really concerning point to be at as a society where everything that's happening is sort of subject to being overlaid with conspiracy theories that are completely unfounded. And then as media and journalists and commentators or whatever, you know, social analysts, academics, you know, you then have to spend a lot of time sort of fact-checking in order to try to convince people that stuff is true, and then they'll probably ignore it anyway. So, yeah.
It is such an interesting time, isn't it? We've watched, you know, kind of that trust barometer broadly tanking for the last few years, but I think most people would agree that we're not in a good place in society when we don't have trust in our institutions, and that includes business, media, government, and, you know, our civil society organisations. And I'm intrigued for how we're going to walk back from here.
I am too. And, you know, I think the situation that we've endured in Victoria these last few months has been quite an interesting case where, you know, you've had mistakes that were plainly made. You've had a government sort of trying to resolve those errors while also implementing policy to fix a really complex situation. And then a lot of sort of not only the usual finger pointing that would go on, but actual sort of attacks on the very premise of the situation that we're in, which is there is no virus, you know, which is the more extreme end of the conspiracy theory. But, you know, in the end, when you look at the Victorian situation and consider that, considering how much doubt there is around truth and how trust has been eroded, the majority of people still did adhere to the expectations of the restrictions in Victoria. So in that sense, our sort of social norms of obedience, for example, did hold up in that situation, luckily, which, you know, now seems to be coming to the end that everyone desired.
I think it's interesting, the social norms and obedience in the context of next Tuesday as well. Will there be civil unrest? Will there be peaceful transitions of power? It's an interesting turn of phrase to use in the context of what we've been talking about. And to that end, final question, aside from the obvious result that you're looking for next week, what are you watching for in the election results and how that all plays out? What has got your interest?
Well, the first thing I'll be looking at is particular states. So as the results come in, I'll be looking really closely at Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Arizona, and then some of those lake states. And sort of they're the ones that I think are key, particularly Florida and Pennsylvania. I think, you know, if Trump wins Florida, then he might have it. How tight it is, because obviously that's going to go to how quickly we'll have a result, particularly with all that pre-voting that we've seen. A very tight election might not bode well for a result being accepted, whereas obviously a clear-cut result in either direction will be much simpler, not only to read, but for people to accept. The third thing I think is the head-to-head vote versus that electoral college vote, because that's been a deep sort of issue of burning frustration for Democrats over the last few years that Hillary won the popular vote but didn't win the election. And obviously, you know, we saw that with Gore way back in 2000. So that's quite central. So there, in terms of the immediate election itself, that's what I'll be watching. And then if the result is very tight, then it's all those questions around recounts, potential court action, hold-ups. And it's when that starts happening that we see like a potential erosion of law and order, a lot of this distrust starting to spike because people will start questioning, you know, the way the count is being conducted, who's doing it, you know, whether the results have been fiddled with, all those sorts of things. And that then allows that injection of destabilisation that Donald Trump has done so well to his own advantage throughout his presidency in various ways, to sort of turn people, to make them think, well, someone's doing something wrong to stop him from winning. And, you know, it needs to be very tight for him to be able to sort of mobilise that kind of view. That said, I know there's been a lot of talk about Trump not accepting the results, and he's kind of deliberately fed that a little bit with his sort of offhand, oh, well, we'll see kind of attitude, although I know he has also said, yeah, I'll accept it. But I've never really thought that he would actually kind of bunker down in the White House and refuse to go. I feel like that's a bit of a Trumpism. It's kind of watch what he does rather than what he says. Yeah. And you know, I think it's the kind of thing that it's very Trump thing to say, to kind of wind everyone up and make people sort of feel like that's going to happen. And I think the chances of that happening are actually quite low.
Interesting. And I feel like whatever happens, there's still a few twists and turns in the 2020 roller coaster to play out. So it's going to be very interesting to watch. Zoe, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your insights. All the best with that rapid deadline to get that book out to all of us by early next year. I can't wait to read it, and I really appreciate you making the time.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks, Holly.